Thrilled to be here this morning and really excited about the session that we're going to have. Education, I think, is near and dear to all of our hearts. It's near to mine personally, but also professionally. And I'm excited to introduce these two gentlemen because I think all of us share a real passion and belief that education and learning is really what opens up doors to possibility and to the world and what brings us all together. So we're going to be talking about a number of issues today. In particular, we'd hope to cover today discussions about the broken linkage between education and employers, and within that, the importance of global competence. I think that's something that we are all really interested to understand more of. The role of technology in education, and Brandon and Tom have promised me that they might have some slightly controversial or unexpected points of view on this. The role of teachers and faculty and the challenges that they're facing in the K-12 system. And in particular, I think we'll have some interesting discussions about governance. And all in all, we're going to bring together, and with the vast experience of Tom and Brandon that I will share with you, a notion of bringing research and real-life experience to how do we tackle some of the challenges that are facing education, both in this country and around the world. So as means of introduction, these guys have remarkable resumes, and just so thrilled that you're here. Brandon currently leads the development of Gallup's education work. His work integrates Gallup's research that we're all familiar with on science, on selection, strengths, engagement, and well-being to improve student success, teacher effectiveness, and educational outcome. And I loved reading about your mission, Brandon, which is to create a national movement to measure the educational outcomes that matter most, connect education to jobs and job creation, and promote a paradigm shift from knowledge mastery to emotional engagement in education. And I know you're going to talk a lot about what that means and what education is all about beyond the facts and the figures. His career spans a wide range of work in education as an entrepreneur, a speaker. I know that many of you have had the privilege of having him speaking at your councils or members of the Gallup organization. He's also the founder and former CEO of Outside the Classroom, a company that pioneered adaptive online education in alcohol abuse and prevention. And I think we'll hear a lot, as I mentioned previously, about the role of technology in learning. And as I mentioned, Brandon is a nationally known speaker and author on education policy and public health. And I've asked him if he wouldn't sort of follow me around because he has a statistic for every single point of view you could possibly have. So he is our whisperer of data. Tom Leppert is the CEO of Kaplan Incorporated, the global education services company, and he oversees the company's divisions including Kaplan Test Prep, Kaplan Higher Education, and Kaplan International. Many of us know Kaplan best as a test prep company, but Kaplan has pioneered new territory in online higher education, K-12 services, and professional training. And I learned just this morning you educate more accountants in the United Kingdom than anybody else. Is that correct?
We do.
They have over 400 locations, more than 1 million students each year, and over 21,000 employees. But that is just the latest chapter in Tom's career. Tom has had a remarkable career as an extensive leader. He's been a CEO of multiple companies, but he has also served in public service as well. He was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, where he had an extraordinarily strong education agenda. He launched the Every Child Ready to Read at Dallas program, but you've been engaged in education your entire career. In addition to his work as mayor, Tom chaired the West Dallas Community School, a private faith-based K-8 school in one of the lowest income areas in the nation, and he served on the board of a local high school, Claremont McKenna College, and Harvard Business School alumni. And if that wasn't enough, you were the White House Fellow in 1984 under President Ronald Reagan and was appointed by President George W. Bush to the White House Fellows Commission. So I think without further ado, we have two extraordinary individuals who are going to share their stories and thoughts with us. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, Have we decided who's going first? Did we? We had breakfast this morning. We spent a whole hour preparing for this, but I don't think either one of us asked who was going to go first. So
I'll leave it to you.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to this audience and the World Affairs Councils, because I've been part of many of your conferences at a national level and local level, and it's one of the rare, unique places in America where thoughtful conversations are actually taking place on important issues. And that, somebody laughed. That should be a joke. Unfortunately, it's not. And I was reminded of this because I had the privilege of having dinner with Thomas Friedman about a month ago, and somebody asked him the question, what's different when you first started writing and reporting in Washington versus now? And this was his statement. He said, no one is having a real conversation anymore. And he talked about how in the 80s he would be able to sit down with congressmen and congresswomen and actually have really engaged dialogue. And now everybody's day is chopped up in 15-minute increments. And we're not having real conversations. And I think one of the things that I've seen to be most valuable especially is not only having these real conversations, but in audiences where all the different sectors of society are together. Usually we have a higher ed conference with higher ed people. We have a K-12 conference with K-12 people. We have a business conference with business leaders. We have, and I just think this audience represents an incredible combination of business leaders, civic leaders, education leaders. So I just wanted to start by saying I'm grateful for what you've created.
And I would echo those comments. I've had a chance to be involved with World Affairs Councils a number of different ways over the years. And my feelings are very similar to what Brandon said. In addition to that, a good friend is Jim Falk, and if you want anything done in Dallas, Jim is the first one to go to. Even when I was mayor, everybody went to him, and they probably got a lot more done.
So with that, I'd just like to open up with a key summary of some of the rather troubling research that Gallup has done. Well, our research hasn't been troubling, but some of the findings from it have been troubling. I should clarify that. Here's what I would give you as a short digest of where we are as a country. As it relates to education and the economy. And by the way, it's hard to pull those apart. Those are kind of the same conversation, because if we're really thoughtful about it, it's our talent development pipeline. And I would argue that we don't really have a pipeline. We have it more in fits and starts. There's K-12, which is entirely disconnected from higher education, which is entirely disconnected from employers, not just businesses, but all employers. And so here's what we've learned from various studies we've done in the last year. In a study of 5th through 12th graders, we just interviewed 890,000 5th through 12th graders in the United States. They get less engaged each year they are in school. So in elementary school, 76% of students are engaged. By middle school, it's 61%. By high school, it's 44%. It literally just goes down every year. If we were doing this right, those numbers ought to be going in the opposite direction, or at least being maintained. So the longer students are in school, the less engaged they become, which is pretty tough to swallow. The way we measure students and teachers in schools right now is around a very, very narrow set of metrics. And I'm not suggesting we throw these out, but let's just pause on what I think was one of the most important education stories in the world last year. You might have caught this, you might have missed it. When Google's head of people, Laszlo Bock, came out in an interview and said it was a conversation about what Google has learned about big data in their HR function. And in the middle of the interview, as kind of a side comment, they asked him, well, anything else interesting you've learned? He said, oh yeah, there was one other interesting finding. He said, we found no relationship whatsoever between the grades and test scores of applicants and their success on the job at Google. So we've stopped asking about it. Now just pause on that for a minute. Google is one of the world's most admired employers. You want to know how many people applied for a job at Google last year? It's 2 million. You want to know how many they hired? 5,000. 0.25%, right? So this changes what we think of as selectivity. I mean, Harvard looks like a wide open community college in relation to Google when it comes to selectivity. And so, but the stunning thing is that we've put almost all of our weight on how we evaluate students and their teachers and the schools around those measures. And again, I'm not saying that we entirely throw them out, but when Google comes out and says something like that, you have to realize that there's so much more to success that we don't understand, that we're not paying attention to, that we're not measuring. And so I'll give you this stat about the broken linkage between education and the economy. We did a survey of chief academic officers at colleges and universities. We asked them to what degree they feel they're preparing students for success in the workplace. 96% of chief academic officers are either somewhat or extremely confident that they're doing a good job on that measure. Well, in a similar question, we asked the American population, general population of Americans, do you think college graduates are well prepared for success in the workplace? Tom knows where I'm going with this. 14% strongly agreed. Do you see the difference there? I mean, it's just unbelievable. And then in another survey of C-level business leaders, we asked them a similar question. 11% strongly agreed that college graduates had the skills and experiences to fill the jobs they were looking for. So I don't know where the truth lands, but this disconnect is just an unbelievable disconnect. I don't even know if we're having the same conversation. So let me just wrap up on this point. We've got a lot of negativity about the profession of teaching in the United States. We're going to talk about governance and some other things that might be leading to this, but this is one I can't live with, and as Americans, I don't think any of you can live with. We found out that as a profession, teachers are dead last of all professions in the United States, behind truck drivers, coal miners, and everybody else, on saying that their opinions at work count. Whatever we've done where that is a reality in our country, shame on all of us, right? I mean, if there's any profession that might be the key to unlocking all talent in all professions, you could boil it down to the profession of teaching. And here we are, we have a very negative conversation about teaching, like it's this horrible thing to go into. As a profession, they actually have incredibly high well-being, but it's their work environment that's suffering. And it's on things as fundamental as feeling their opinions count.
Well, and you see that in so many different ways, too. One of the more interesting studies that was ever done on education, with all of the talk of dollars that go in per student, the talk about the size of classroom, that sort of thing, it actually compared countries, not just states. So you pulled Mississippi out so nobody could be totally happy. But you looked at it versus nations, and they found out that there was one factor that determined the quality of education, K through 12, throughout the world. It didn't matter how much money you put into it. It didn't matter the size of the classroom. There was only one factor. Did your teachers come out of the top third of your college graduates, or did they come out of the bottom third? Finland, they come out of the top third. The United States, they come out of the bottom third. And until we're willing to address that, it doesn't work. And I can tell you as mayor, we were talking about it earlier, I spent a lot of time in churches in South Dallas talking to teachers. They will tell you that they have completely been disconnected since the early 1990s. They have no control over the classroom, a combination of federal regulations that have kind of categorized, bracketed them, limited what they can do in the classroom so that they have no control over it, plus the whole issue of seniority. Now, you probably saw the Superman movie and the lemon draft and things like that. Unfortunately now what's happening too is we've got more young people going into education than we ever have before. That's exciting, that's terrific. We ought to be excited about that. The problem is those young people get in education and the turnover is astronomical because they get in and all of a sudden they are spending great hours, they're making terrific results, and they turn around and see that the only thing that matters is seniority. So they'd rather go over to Google, where if they do great things, they're rewarded and they're honored. So we've got a broken education system. Unfortunately, it does start in the classroom.
So I asked Tom this question this morning over breakfast because I'm interested in it. You know, we obviously are in the middle of an interesting political election that just took place. Some really interesting, bizarre things happening in our country as it relates to politics, our view of politics. But I'm worried, and this is what I asked Tom, that we've turned education into something very political. And my question to him was, has it always been that way? Or is it becoming more political? And I'll just give you the reason why I asked him. You know, Gallup did some polling last week of teachers and parents about Common Core. And many of you have been following the now debate about Common Core. And our findings are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican, you hate it. And if you're a Democrat, you like it. Whether you're a teacher, a parent, just a general citizen of the United States, and you realize that what has happened with one of our, hailed as one of our great education reform opportunities of the last 2 decades, is that we've turned it into a political debate, and basically your opinions of it are not necessarily based on how informed you are of Common Core, it's where you fall out on party lines. So my question to Tom was, is education getting more political, or has it always been this way?
It's getting much more political. I think a couple of things go to it. Clearly the amount of money that's gone into it. So there's a control issue that's related to the amount of money. I think people now understand that it's failing. They're seeing their children, they're seeing children around them that are failing, so all of a sudden it's become a political issue and it's been thrown into that in entire realm. And it's unfortunate because I view the same thing. You know, Common Core, if they had just thought about it differently and not tried to make it across the board, but almost made it a guidance at the state level and that sort of thing, you'd see a very different picture because it did get into greater issues, state control, et cetera, those sorts of things. So a lot of people who either are for it or opposed to it, either case, they've never read it. They don't understand what's in it.
Yeah. And so, this is linked to a question about governance, which was something we were talking about as well, and the idea that we're not talking about we're very critical of superintendents, school leadership. We're very critical of teachers in this country. But the one place that shocks me, that has been removed from a lot of critique, is the governance of school boards, the governance of universities and colleges, right? And the degree to which we actually feel like they're well governed. This was an interesting stat. We surveyed 2,500 superintendents in the United States. 4% of them strongly agree that school boards are well governed in the United States. So, you know, the school boards can rate their superintendents and evaluate them. This was a rating of superintendents of their boards, right? And I mean, that's not a really impressive number. How are we doing with school governance?
Governance is broken. There's absolutely no question about it. When I was mayor, the statistic I would use, or the anecdote, is go to a school board meeting at any large core metropolitan area of our nation, the school board's there. Now, I'm not sure it applies to some of the more rural or the smaller ones, but go to a large one. And time, the amount of minutes that are spent talking about adults, next vendor relationship, the next contract, the teachers, et cetera, versus the time that's spent actually talking about kids, or worse than kids, the outcomes that come out of kids. It is all spent on adults, and in part because the system's broken. In Dallas, as an example, you can get elected to the school board with 400 votes. That means one vendor, one person that's interested in a contract with a school system, and there's billions of dollars worth of this, they can get somebody elected. That becomes what their allegiance, what their interest is. It's not the school outcomes. And it's absolutely broken. I can tell you, if you look around in, again, major metropolitan areas, you will not find significant success being made in any school district unless the governance has been thrown upside down. New Orleans, thrown out. Good school versus bad school. Governor takes it over. Mayor takes it over. Where you've got a very different set of accountability, because in the end, the way it's structured is there's no accountability at the school board level. There's just no accountability.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, I think that's very true in thinking about school boards. I think a lot of people think we've got this nailed at the college and university level. I don't think that's the case either, right? I mean, you know, you've got governor-appointed trustees in a lot of these roles, which may or may not be well-qualified people, right? I mean, we know all the different decisions that might be involved in a governor-appointed role. But then you also have private universities where there's 36 members of the board, and they all had to give about $5 million each in order to be on the board, right? And I'm being a little critical, but I think there's some truth to, are they really the most invested in the university? Are they really the best qualified to be governing the university? Or are they simply the people that were able to write the biggest checks? Now, so I just think there's a lot of questions about how well are we doing at a governance level. And even today, actually, in Inside Higher Ed News, the Association of Governing Boards, which is the association of trustees in college and universities, put out a big report about their extreme concerns about poor governance in higher education. So this is not just you and I kind of making this up on the panel today. I mean, there's some real conversation starting about that, but we've hardly had any so far about governance.
No question. And a large part is we need to understand that, especially at the K-12 level, historically, we've seen a decline. And again, you gave a number of statistics. You look at the progress of the United States. If you look at science, math, at one time we were at the top of the heap. Now we're between 20th and 30th when you look at us in the industrialized world. By the way, there's only 29 countries. So if you're at 28, that's not a very good situation. So you've got all of those, that data that's shining in your face of the quality has gone down. But the thing we also don't understand is 30 or 40 years ago, it was all right for our nation to fail in about 30%, maybe 40% of the cases. We had assembly line type of jobs where, to be truthful with you, didn't have to have an education. You could have good income, benefits, pensions, et cetera. Those jobs don't exist anymore. So while we've seen the quality of education go down, unfortunately the bar's gone up when we just don't have the luxury of failing anymore.
Yeah, you know, and America's not alone in this. I mean, you know, you travel all over around the world. I've done a little bit of that, and everybody in every country I've visited is concerned about the same basic things, right? Is our education system working? You know, we've got this weird paradox of all these unfilled jobs, but high unemployment rates, you know, and you say, well, how is that possible? I mean, there definitely is something about this skills gap, experience gap that's very real. But, you know, I wonder too, Tom, I mean, I do think it's important that we don't feel good about how we score on international math and science standards, right? The U.S. is not doing great on those measures, and we need to improve. But I'll throw in a little wrinkle to this, because I also think it's a question of what are we really measuring and what are we really trying to accomplish. And so here's just an interesting little stat. It turns out that in the 32 countries where there's overlapping measures between PISA standardized test scores and what's called the Global Entrepreneurship Measure, some people just call it GEM, it's a measure of entrepreneurial activity in those countries. It's a negative correlation. And what was fascinating is 2 years ago, when I was here at the World Affairs Council, I was on a panel with the ambassador from Singapore, and they're number one in the world in standardized math testing. And so he was on the panel to talk about the success Singapore had, and he was very gracious. He actually started by saying the thing they're most worried about right now is the entrepreneurial energy in their country and the creativity of opportunities for creativity in school. And so it's really interesting because, there was Singapore, number one. They ought to be like, we feel really great about that. They feel good about it, make no mistake, but they're concerned about this entrepreneurial activity. If you look at where we are in the U.S., this is the scariest economic data I can give you, is that for about the last 30 years since the U.S. government has been tracking new business births and new business deaths, how many businesses are started in the U.S. each year, how many go out of business each year. Through good and bad economic times, there has always been consistently 100,000 more new businesses being started than dying every year, until 2009. And those numbers literally just crossed. And now we're running a 70,000 new business deficit. So there's 70,000 more businesses dying each year than being born, so it's really almost a 200,000 differential. Now, you've probably seen this data. Almost all new jobs are created by what? Small and medium businesses less than 5 years old. So if you just want to know how are we doing as an economy, don't look at the stock market, don't look at unemployment rates. I mean, those things pale in comparison to the new business birth death thing. How do we get back on track with that?
You're absolutely right. And I think there's two pieces. Education is part of it. The other thing, again, it goes back to my analogy on with the teachers, is the regulatory environment has become so very difficult that it really discourages the startups and new businesses. I can tell you, I get out and talk to a lot of folks who are trying to start up new businesses, some in the education and some outside. And the regulatory environment of what you need to do just to be able to start a business has become so constraining that it's been a disincentive. And the combination of that on the education front and then that kind of the entrepreneurial encouragement to start it. As you said, startups have literally fallen off the cliff, and that's where jobs come from. That's part of the problem that we're having today with the disconnect on unemployment.
Yeah. And I think, so if you take it down into schools, Gallup's been doing a lot of thinking about this. Our chairman, Jim Clifton, is incredibly provocative on this point. He would say that as a country, our school system is very good at identifying a very narrow set of talents. And if you think of the myriad talent that exists across our country, I mean, it's like a fingerprint, right? Every one of us has a unique talent signature where somewhere there's a perfect fit for what we're really good at. It's a matter of how you get to that place. But here's the point he makes. He said, we're really good at identifying kids with high IQ because we've got a lot of great tests that cognitively will identify a kid who's really smart. So it's really hard to hide in this country if you have a high IQ because we'll find you. We're pretty good at that. We're also pretty good at finding kids with extreme athletic talent because we've built an amazing talent identification system and development system around that. If you see, we're talking about this, if you see a kid in Texas in 7th grade throw a football and there's a talent scout there, they can tell you right then and there whether they have the talent to be a professional player. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things that could derail them, but in terms of the talent, you can see that in 7th grade. We can see it with gymnasts, with swimmers, right? It's just, so we're real good at that. Here's the question. How do we identify a kid who might be an amazing entrepreneur in school? This is another half joke, but it's also half truth. I actually think we're better at identifying that kid as somebody who might be on ADHD medication than we would to look at them as the next Mark Zuckerberg, right? I mean, because what do? We have this lens through problem identification. I even get this. I'm a parent of a 5 and a 3-year-old. I have an app that tells me everything I should be worried about, every sign of every problem on earth that I should freak out about, right? I'm trained as a parent to identify problems in my children. I'm not trained to identify strengths in them or their talents, right? And so when I see my kid hitting somebody, I think that's a bad thing. And I think, well, maybe he just needs to work his energy out, right? And so what do? I put him in Taekwondo. But if you're not careful, right, you punish him for trying to be, you get the idea. So I really worry about this. If we got a kid who might have some real entrepreneurial talent, what do we do to identify that kid and put him or her on a developmental pathway? Our numbers on that are poor. Are really poor. I mean, how do you think about that? I mean, I know Kaplan is wrestling with this in terms of.
I think a lot of it is understanding the outcomes, and you touched on it a little bit earlier. We are very poor at understanding outcomes in the higher education system that we have today. At Kaplan, we have put an awful lot of resources, and I think fairly said, and people would recognize this from the outside, we've put more money into learning sciences. Not just what the grade was, but what the skill is, and did you master that skill when you completed whatever the course of work happened to be. And what we find is very simply, you can talk to the student and you can get a recommendation rate. I love the experience. You can talk to the professor and they got an A, but that really wasn't the mastery of the material. That was how they interacted with the professor and those sorts of things. What the employer is, and it goes back to that disconnect, the employer today is stepping back and saying, in today's competitive world, I need people that have mastered the skill. I don't care if they've got the piece of paper, I don't care what the grades were, e.g. the Google, I want to know if they've mastered the skill. So what you're seeing in education, we made a major investment now to do what we call boot camps, where it is very disciplined. It is 12 weeks, very high price point, but 12 weeks, and it's focused on a single skill. We place those people at incredible rates, rates that make the Harvard numbers coming out with an undergraduate degree pale in comparison, because employers today don't care about those things. They want to understand, did the student master the particular skill that I have to pay for? I'm not willing to pay for all these other things that historically we've gotten as part of a college education. I need a skill that's going to push my company forward. And the other thing that we're learning, and we talked about this earlier, is we've had a system that's basically ingrained on producing all of these skills that you need the rest of your life for 4 years.
Yeah.
But then you go out and work for 40 years, and the reality of it is, with new knowledge, the information exchanges, all those sorts of things, the reality of it is now a lifelong learning exercise. So it's going to be much more building skills over time. So this whole idea that I get a college education, I'm done, what employers are really going to look for is, give me a skill, I'll milk that until information changes, then I'll go ahead and produce another skill, I'll get the benefit out of that, and on I'll go. So it becomes much more of lifelong learning that's going to change the education system. It's why we were talking, you can get at it for different reasons. Literally half of the educational institutions, higher education, colleges and universities, in the space of 20 years, and I may be wrong, I'm not going to be wrong on the number, I may be wrong on the time, half of them simply won't exist. If you don't have a great endowment, or you don't have a great reputation, or you're funded by a public entity, you're not going to exist in 20 years. It's going to be done and gone, because the cost structure of those systems simply aren't going to deliver what employers are going to demand.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that point, because the famous Harvard Business School professor, Clayton Christensen, many of you know the name, wrote Innovator's Dilemma. He's been very convincing on this point, saying what you did. I mean, he's predicted that half of all colleges and universities will not be operating as they are now inside of 15 years. But before we dive into that, I want to go back to a point that I think you made that's just so important. Students aren't going through school or through college to get a degree. This is such an important point. They're doing it to get a good job. And if we fail to recognize that, to your point, right, what's the real outcome we're aiming at? Retention does not mean you were engaged.
And job might not be high income. It may be something you want to do. So it doesn't have to be an economic.
I think that's the important conversation. When we say good job, we're not just talking about how much money somebody makes, which is a very narrow way of looking at it, but something where you're doing something meaningful, right? Where you have a chance to do what your best at each day. These would be Gallup measures of what a good job looks like. And yes, certainly, what kind of income factors into it, but it's actually much less important than aligning your talent with the job and what you end up doing each day, right? And so it turns out for all of us in this room, maybe the most important question in the world for our own development and our own success is just this simple question. Do you have a chance to do what you're best at each day? There's probably most of us in this room that strongly agrees to that statement. It turns out it's the single most important predictor of student success in schools too. So we ask students, do you have a chance to do what you're best at each day in school? Want to know what % of American students strongly agree with that? It's 48%. Here's the killer finding, though, that if they do agree with it, there's virtually no chance that they're disengaged in school. It's actually 1%. So now think about this. What are we doing in our school system to allow each student, not all day long, to do what they're best at, but at some point in the day to put their finger on that moment? I worry greatly that we are missing this opportunity. I mean, it might be more flexibility in the educational process, not cramming more things into it. And, but I mean, if you don't get this point about they're not going to college anymore to get a degree, they're going to get a good job, we kind of miss everything. Because there's a lot of degrees being conferred that don't end up with a good job. And it's not just about salary, to your point.
Well, and part of it is understanding the different student needs, too. I'll make this very personal. I had run businesses in 5 or 6 different industries, large businesses. And I never thought I was going to go back and do the 24/7 CEO. But clearly the time I spent on the private side, but also as mayor, I got engaged in education. And the sort of things that we've been talking about, saw how broken it was. I was approached by Kaplan. Kaplan doesn't deal with Harvard graduates. That's not what our market is. We deal with students who are, you would call them non-traditional or high risk. They probably didn't succeed in the educational system, kind of K-12, maybe that early education system when you went directly from college, from high school. They have probably been out of the system for probably 6, 7 years. They are dependent, there's no parents. They probably have 1 or 2 jobs. In a lot of cases, they've got dependents. In a lot of cases, we're the last opportunity to start moving up that economic ladder. That was the appeal, because as mayor, I went in areas of Dallas that I can guarantee you no elected official has gone to. That's the challenge we have as a country. With all due respect to the Harvards, to the Claremonts, et cetera, those students are going to succeed no matter what. It's this group of students that we need to. That was why I got involved in Kaplan. Kaplan is a for-profit, and probably you're familiar with some of the regulatory that's going back and forth on for-profit. What people lose sight of is our graduation rate for that at-risk is double what it is for the population. Because a lot of the institutions, the traditional institutions, the public institutions, have no idea how to deal with that student. That student has a whole series of different needs that have to be addressed. It's why those students at a community college have about a 1/3 chance of succeeding, 3 times greater at an institution like Kaplan. Because again, we're not dealing with the traditional students. In fact, we probably don't know how to deal with those students, to be frank with you. But this other segment we do. And unfortunately, too often in education, we kind of throw everybody in one bucket and assume that the system is going to meet their needs. We would never do that in any other business in this world. We would never do that. But education, for some reason, we assume everything's the same.
Yeah, and it's a great segue to talk about what do we really know about student success, right? And I think this relates very much to global competencies. What are employers really looking for? They're looking for students who have had, number one answer for business leaders, when we ask them what they're looking for, is just students who have had some real work experience. That's it. It's just a simple bar, an internship, some experience before. Gallup just finished the largest representative study of college graduates in U.S. history. Here's the pathetic point. It's the only large-scale representative study that's ever been done on college graduates. That's hard to believe. Think about it, right? 300 years the institution of higher education has existed in our country, and we've never really measured the long-term outcome of its product, its graduates. So Gallup interviewed some 30,000 college graduates, and we asked them questions like household and personal income and profession, the things that you would think of would be obvious, but what we were really interested in was the degree to which they're engaged in their current work and the degree to which they're thriving in their overall well-being. These are constructs Gallup has measured. Now, let me just be very brief about why they matter. The way we measure workplace engagement is predictive of all sorts of key performance indicators: absenteeism, turnover, productivity, revenue, profitability, right? So the reason why business leaders care about something soft and fluffy like engagement is simply because it's predictive of those things. And it's the same thing with well-being. The way we measure well-being, there's 5 critical elements of it, but here's the simple point. That if you have an employee who's thriving in all 5 elements, they have 1/3 the healthcare cost burden of an employee who's not. Now think about that for a minute. We have a $2.7 trillion healthcare tab in the United States right now. That's bigger than the entire GDP of Russia. Our country is going bankrupt because of our healthcare tab. I'll say it. Now, do you think well-being is a good thing to invest in when I put it in that framework? Yeah, it's not just a soft, fluffy, nice to have. These are very important measures and metrics. Here's the point, that when we looked at college graduates in the US, we found 6 really magical ingredients about what happened to them in college, what they took advantage of in college, that were predictive of their long-term success in work and their overall lives. 6 special things. Here's what they were. There were 3 that we called emotional support and 3 that we called deep experiential and learning. So you think about programs like Academic World Quest. I mean, I'm going to describe it for you through our research. But the first 3 were whether you strongly agree, ask yourselves these questions, you strongly agree to these 3 questions. I had at least 1 professor who made me excited about learning. 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree. That the professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. And that I had a mentor who encouraged my goals and dreams. Doesn't that sound so fluffy? God, are you kidding me? Encouraged my goals and dreams? Okay, here's the killer thing. That if you said strongly agree to those 3 things, it doubled your odds of being engaged in your work, and you are 3 times as likely to be thriving in your well-being over your lifetime. These are career and life trajectory game changers. And they go both ways, right? To what degree did the university support that and happening for more students? But it's also to what degree a student owned their own educational experience. But here's the killer. For as potent as those 3 things are, what % of US college graduates nailed all 3? It's 14%. That's it. It's 14%. Now, on the deep experiential learning ones, these were the 3. I worked on a long-term project that took a semester or more to complete. That sounds like every college graduate should have hit that one, right? 29% did. That they were able to apply what they were learning in an internship or job, which was a sorting question, because we asked about a paid job. That didn't sort, but if you said you had a job or internship where you applied what you were learning, it did. And the final one was whether they were extremely involved in an extracurricular activity organization. Turns out only 6% of Americans nailed those 3. And so when you boil it down, the 2 things that were the single most important predictors of long-term success were whether you had a mentor who encouraged your goals and dreams. That was number 1 of the 6. And number 2 was whether you had a job or internship where you applied what you were learning. But the paltry numbers of how we're doing on those measures across higher education is just, it's unfathomable to me how poor we're doing on those outcomes.
We are, and this is where each one of you, I think, almost needs to put it on your shoulders, because each one of you have a significant impact on your communities. It really is all about education. If you look at the Texas penal system, 91% of the individuals in the Texas penal system don't have a high school degree. If you turn around and say, find a college graduate that's been raised by 2 parents, the unemployment rate is less than 1.5%. Less than 1.5%. It is all about education. And until we get our arms around that, we are never going to understand how to deal with all of the issues that follow from that. And here is the killer. This administration will probably the first administration in history where college attainment will go down. College attainment is going down today in America. At a time when only 20 or 30 years ago we were number 1, we're now 12th, and we're a stagnant 12th. Yep. In a world where education is everything, and I can tell you, we're operating 60 different countries, 60 different countries. The world is understanding the importance of education. For the first time, countries, developing countries, understand that their resources need to be not in military, but in education, both to elevate the country, but also to protect the political leaders. They have to put their money in education. Yep. And for the first time, education, because of the technology, can be delivered. So the hurdle is going to go up and up, which is terrific for the world. I think people, you're going to have a chance to attain opportunities in countries that you never would have 10 or 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. From the United States perspective, though, that has been what has led us to be the success that we are in the world today, and that competitive advantage is going away very quickly. Just think of that. The first time in history that college attainment is going down. save a war situation like that.
Yeah, and if we and there's many reasons why it's going down. I mean, affordability is one of the big issues. We also know that quality is being called into question. So Gallup's done a lot of research on this, and there's still extraordinary demand in this country for education beyond high school. 95% of all Americans strongly agree that education beyond high school is important. That's an amazing stat because, of course, only about 40% of Americans have any education beyond high school. So even those who don't understand its importance, right? And yet, but what's being called into question is quality. And what do they judge quality by? I've already given you the answer. Whether you get a good job. And so when you peel all this away, here's an interesting stat. You know, you look at international rankings of higher education, the U.S. dominates the list, U.S. institutions. We asked C-level business leaders in America the question. 19% of our business leaders in America right now strongly agree that we have the highest quality higher education system in the world. I mean, that's unbelievable. And by the way, if you ask parents of 5th through 12th graders, this was a killer finding. What they thought was the best path to a good job for their child. This is a general population of American adults who have kids in 5th through 12th grade. Number one was career and technical training. They see a lot of value in that. Give me a skill, get me a job. So to many of the things that you just mentioned. Number two was no college at all, which beat out number three, which was a liberal arts degree. Now, I know, raise your hands proudly. How many of you have a liberal arts degree? Come on, put them up. Here's the thing I'll tell you about it. It's got a branding issue right now. It's got a branding issue.
Like Common Core.
Like Common Core, right? You don't want your kid to be common, you want them to be uncommon. And liberal arts, what does that mean? That sounds real soft and fluffy, but guess what does resonate with Americans? 21st century skills, Tom, right? I mean, and what do they put under that heading? Critical thinking, collaboration, skilled communication, right? Many things that are the hallmark of liberal arts. So, you know, look, is it one or the other, or is it both? What do we need?
You need both, and we see it. That was mentioned in the introduction. We're the largest trainer of accountants in the UK, and what's phenomenal about that, and our folks do a terrific job. They have for a long period of time. The success rate of getting through the exams is like 98.5%. But what you've seen in the last couple of years is the employers coming back to us and saying, while we appreciate that, that's no longer good enough. Because now I've got to have somebody that can actually bill out to a client. So it's not just the technical skills, they've got to be able to interact with the client, and they've got to be able to translate those technical skills into critical thinking that are of value to that client, e.g. the client will want to pay me as the firm. And that's what we've lost. It doesn't take long. When I was mayor, we brought a lot of interns in, a lot of interns in. And it was, and you've probably seen the same thing. It was amazing the number of those interns that didn't have the basic skills. And they went through 4-year schools that if I gave you the names, you would think those are clearly higher echelon. One comes to mind who couldn't write. It wasn't that they were a bad writer, they could not write. So you've got a whole host of students that are coming out of 4-year schools and they don't know how to write, in part because they don't have the critical thinking, but they don't know how to write. Literally at Kaplan, we're going to spend $1 million this year on trying to think about, through our learning sciences, how do you improve composition skills? Because it doesn't matter where in the world you are, if you don't understand how to write, you're going to be at an incredible disadvantage.
Yeah. We haven't talked about technology. Maybe it's the last thing we'll comment on, then we'd love to open it up to your questions. What's our time check on how much time we have left in the session?
20 minutes.
Perfect. So we'll leave us for some good questions. If you don't have any questions, we're just going to keep talking. I know you do. So the role of technology in education, right? And in many ways, it's been hyped as the savior of education. Sling a kid an iPad and we've got all of our problems solved. And by the way, this is coming from a former founder and CEO of an online education company. So I obviously believe in the power of technology if it's rightly applied. But here's where I think we're making a big mistake. Back to this Clayton Christensen prediction. I actually think his prediction is right. Half of the universities may go out of business in some form in the next 15 years. I think he's got the premise off. And what I mean by that is that his premise is that it's technology, it's online courses that are going to disrupt everything. here's the interesting stat. I think the real disruption is the fact that colleges and universities aren't even doing the fundamentals well. Because if you think about college graduates, and only 22% of them, for example, had a mentor during their time in college, that means 8 out of 10 didn't. These are not dropouts. These are not high school grads. We're talking about those who got the diploma, a college degree. So I actually think the real disruptive innovation is a university that gets the fundamentals right. And by the way, you can do it with technology. So I'll just give you one last stat. Western Governors University, an adult-only online degree program. And many hail it as it's a technology answer. Technology is a big part of it, but here's the fascinating thing. Their graduates were 3 times higher than the national average on saying they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams. How on earth is that possible? Guess what?
And probably never ever met one of those.
And actually didn't, but their model, they intentionally assign a human being, an advisor, to every single student from the second they enroll to the second they graduate. It's the same person that stays with them. They email, they talk on the phone, they Skype, they do Google Hangouts, but the question wasn't I had an advisor who gave me good advice on what class. No, it was I had a mentor 3 times higher than the national average. The disruptive technology is they figured out how to do the human fundamentals right, and technology was an enabler there. But I don't think we should get the two confused.
I think that's right. I think it's lazy to think that we're going to throw money at education, that's going to solve it, or we'll throw technology at education that's going to solve it. You've got to get the fundamentals right. Back to our earlier part in the conversation. If you don't get governance right, if you don't set up the system right in terms of having competition that pushes the public system, those sorts of things, you're simply not going to get there. And then it goes without saying, you'd better empower the people that are responsible in the public school system, that's the principals and the teachers, and you'd better have standards that push us to achieve what we should be achieving.
Yeah. Well, okay, what do you got for us? How should we handle questions? Do you want to hand out the microphone and be the selector of who gets to? Because I don't want to be the bad guy.
That takes it off, yeah.
Can you guys select who the questions are asked from? Thanks very much. That'd be great.
Am I lucky?
I'll do it. I'll be the bad guy.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I was wondering, there are 14,000 school districts in the United States. I mean, and then you talk about pushing excellence. This to me is an absolutely daunting type of task. I mean, how do you view the entire structure of U.S. education along those lines?
Largely talking K through 12?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you've got to start with 4 things. I think number 1, you've got to have a different governance structure. The school boards in large metropolitan areas don't work. There's simply no accountability. So you've got to deal with that. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to set appropriate standards. One of the things that I was most disappointed at in my home state was recently the superintendent of public schools came out and said, we have to change the standards because the schools can't meet them. Now, think of that for a moment. Think of if you were in charge of, say, product safety, and be it a car or a drug, you said we're going to change the standards because the manufacturers can't achieve those. That's scary. I mean, all of you set standards for your organizations. We ought to set high standards too. The third is empower principals and teachers. Principals have to have the ability to hire and fire. It's simple. No other business can succeed without having that hiring and firing. Yeah. So you've got to set that up. And then the fourth thing you've got to do, I'm convinced of it, you've got to have competition. I believe in any large metropolitan school district, you've got to have 15 to 20% options of choice. That could be a lot of different things. It could be parochial, faith, charter, et cetera, but you've got to have that competition comes in. Once you get those 4 things said, then I think you can start talking about money and some things like that. But no business is ever going to solve a problem by throwing money at it. They're going to make sure their structure is right, then they're going to make the investment.
Yeah, and I'll just add one quick thing. You know, Americans love accountability, by the way, but let's be careful what we're holding people accountable to, especially in schools. I would argue the last 20 years we have done a remarkable job of building an accountability system around schools. What we have failed to do is build an engagement system within them, and those are very different things. So just take one simple example. We have gone a little bit crazy in this country over tests, right? We love tests. And there's some good reason to like tests. They're benchmarks, they're accountability, they're all this. But but almost all of the testing that's done is in the service of summative measures for accountability purposes. They're not necessarily formative in nature, where the individual who takes the test actually gets some helpful information back about how they can improve, what they can do differently, right? What their parent can do to support them in the process, what the teacher, so if we just think about taking testing and moving it from something that's largely used as a summative measure for accountability purposes to one that's a formative measure for how we all actually learn better or improve in the way that you kind of describe your investment in learning sciences, I think that's a game changer in
It's
itself.
the difference between testing and assessing.
That's right.
We do testing, we don't assess.
Yep.
When you assess, you're looking at the critical thinking, you're looking at the mastery of skill. That's very different than testing.
Yep.
Yes. You were talking about how employers want people. You're talking about. I have a big mouth. I need this. You were talking about how employers were looking for people with skills. I lived in Germany for a little while. Have you thought about doing something like their apprenticeship program? Their system wouldn't quite totally work here, but for instance, where I live in Boston, Northeastern has the co-op program where you study and work and study and work. And it's something like that, if we could do that even in the public schools for people learning, because you're right, we do need skills. You cannot just sit in an assembly line these days, it won't work.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind, and that's absolutely correct. But let's not kid ourselves. The need for some element of college education for jobs is going to increase over time just because of the information in that. So the old idea of, I'll use my old model of vocational, that'll solve the problem, which some politicians are using, that's not going to work. It's going to have to be more advanced education than that. It'll still probably fall into the vocational effort. The example you gave is the same one I would have done, is Northeastern. Now what's interesting about Northeastern is they have used the internships, those sorts of things very effectively, but what's almost more interesting than that is what's happened to the institution. The institution was at best a second or third rated institution. Their rankings have absolutely skyrocketed. Brandon and I were talking about this at breakfast. Their rankings have skyrocketed because they have finally understood. They're an institution that employers look at and say, they get it. They're actually giving me a student that's got skills that I can actually employ and get something out of on day one. That's the model that we need to go to. Unfortunately, the mindset of a lot of higher education is, hey, that's not my job. My job is not to prepare anybody to have a skill. My job is to impart knowledge. Mm-hmm. And if I impart knowledge, that's all I need to do. Yep. I don't think the world's in that position any longer. I think we've got to be more demanding of the outcome that we have from education.
I think, let me just throw employers generally under the bus on this one, right? Here's the news flash. You can point a lot of fingers at schools. Schools don't have jobs and internships. They don't offer externships. They don't offer apprenticeships in the ways that we think of the real need for scaling that. And so if employers of all types, government, nonprofit, business, it doesn't matter. If they don't get heavily invested in providing those opportunities by way of their human capital, by way of carving out opportunities for those kinds of experiences, we're dead in the water. So before business leaders start pointing fingers at schools and blaming them for the skills gap and lack of experience, the only place that finger starts to go is right back to them about whether they're playing a role. And I know that was something you did in Dallas.
And that also comes back to the linkage piece of this. Yeah. The linkage piece of this. Again, when you think of a traditional student going to college or going to high school and then going straight to college, we think of that as traditional. That's the student who goes from high school to college and lives on campus. That's only 15% of higher education today. Most of traditional is non-traditional now. And what we don't do is give any type of effect, and it gets back to the cost of an education, for the value of that learning. We're working with the military now, and we are doing assessing of skills that you otherwise would go to a course, spend 6 months in, et cetera, et cetera. And if we can assess somebody and they walk away with those skills already, then we'll give them credit for it. So it reduces the cost of education. Yeah. It allows them to get the particular skills that they need much quicker. But education needs to do that. And again, traditional education is not set up to do that. You've got to get so many credit hours, et cetera. But more and more, when you deal with non-traditional students, you've got to understand what they need and give that credit. That's why Northeastern's doing so well, because employers are seeing that they're walking away with skills of how they're going to succeed on the job on day one.
I'm a middle school social studies teacher. And my question is...
First of all, thanks for what you do. Absolutely.
Wow, it's nice to be loved for once. Excuse me, I'm not used to that.
That's true.
Where does civic education fit in? You talked about businesses looking for the skills that they can make money with. So, how do you see businesses being able to monetize, your civic attitudes and especially things like global competencies?
I think it's an important part. It may not be all of it in higher education, but I think one of the challenges is we haven't done a very good job of that in kind of the K through 12 system. We don't have kids today that can walk out and balance a checkbook. They don't even know how to work with a checkbook. It's that sort of thing. Anybody will tell you that democracy only works as long as you've got an educated workforce. Mm-hmm. When you lose an educated workforce, democracies don't work. We see it all across the world. We've seen it in our history too. So I'm one that would like to see an awful lot of that. Unfortunately, back to the point, has it been politicized? I think both the right and left have tried to use education to kind of play off of theirs as opposed to a fundamental understanding of civics and some of the other basic skills that you need to succeed in life.
Yeah, look, one of the fundamental mission and purpose elements of education is an engaged citizenry too, right? So yes, it is part about how you prepare for workforce and jobs, but that's a big one. And students have a very different definition of that now than we do. I'll just give a simple example, voting, right? All-time low turnout since 1940 in voting. It just happened yesterday. What was it? Was it 2 days ago? I'm losing track of my days. Young people think about having their voice heard in different ways. We think the only definition of that is whether you cast a vote. Well, I'd argue responding to a Gallup survey is a way to have your voice heard too. There's a lot of ways that students can activate their voice and be engaged as a citizen. And I think when you broaden their understanding of what's happening in the world, in the U.S., beyond their town, beyond themselves, which they're very me-centric right now, those are huge opportunities. So we think about all these 21st century skills, right? Learning how to collaborate and understand different perspectives and be a critical thinker and all these things that we talk about. They're deeply embedded in something that we would call civics education. And so I think there's a lot of value to it. But as you know, schools have invested less in that type of stuff. And more importantly, they've invested less in the project-based learning things that really make it come to life. So that's why I'm not just giving a plug to Academic World Quest, but that's a long-term project. You get to apply what you're learning to a real-world problem. These are all things that we found in our research sort on long-term outcomes. And those kinds of programs build the essence of those things. And look, this is an interesting little stat. One of my great regrets in education is I didn't learn a foreign language. It's actually my one great personal regret in education. I did, however, take 1 year of Latin. And yes, I know. And I've thought many times about buying your software as I read the Sky Mall magazine. And I've thought, man, I should get that stuff because then, I could speak Italian to the beautiful Italian farmer, right? What was that ad is like emblazoned in my head, but how did I go down this path? My big regret education is not learning a foreign language, yeah. But what I did learn in Latin was this, that do you know what the Latin root of the word education is? It's essentially educo, which means to lead out of, not stuff into. We need to stop the stuffing, folks, because a lot of what we're doing in school is trying to stuff things into students. I think we have just totally crammed all kinds of things into our day from a curriculum perspective, and there is so very little time to actually experience it, to bring it to life, to apply it, right? And I mean, so if we just get back to the roots of this, the true roots of education, it's to lead out of, not stuff into. And so that, even though I don't know a foreign language, I got that one. Did I bring it home okay?
You got it. God.
My name's Cassandra Capretta, and I'm here for the Columbus Council on World Affairs. And that did bring up a really good quote from Socrates. He actually said that education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel, which I thought was really interesting. So it reminded me of that. But I do have a question concerning, it's actually something that I heard from Sir Ken Robinson. He said that in education, there seems to be a hierarchy. So I would like your opinion on that and like how math is kind of esteemed more than dance or art.
You want to start?
Go ahead. I mean,
it's fun. I've had a lot of really fascinating conversations with Sir Ken. He talks about people finding their element, what they're passionate about, but also what they're good at. And it's very similar to a lot of our Gallup research on strengths-based education, strengths-based leadership. But the point about creativity in school is a very scary one, because there's actually a lot of evidence that when we're younger, we're naturally wonderfully divergent thinkers, and that we actually train that out of students as they go through school. And it's a paranoid thought to me as a parent of young children. I saw my son the other day. He attempted to ride a wooden giraffe in his room. That's an amazing idea, right? Like, why not try to ride the giraffe? But in a couple years, he will be taught that you can't ride a wooden giraffe. And it was just one of those moments as a parent where I sat there thinking about Ken Robinson's points about this, is that we are training creativity out of students. And so he's a big proponent of not losing sight of those things that draw it out, right? Arts, theater, and guess what? These are all things that have been increasingly cut from schools. And I'll just add one more. There's so much science about the importance of exercise and learning. There's just so much science about this. And I was sitting with the principal of the school my kids will be going to, an elementary school. This is an elementary school. And he was very proud of the fact that he fought to increase recess from 10 to 15 minutes each day. And I sat there and I thought, oh my God, I would have flunked out of first grade myself if recess was 15 minutes. And I mean, so it's just the fact that we're taking out these areas of creativity, of opportunity to explore, to test things, to try things. I mean, it's really concerning. But I mean, how we get back to just tapping into how we're naturally hardwired, we're actually going against that in a lot of ways. It's frightening to me.
yeah, please don't think that, understanding the greater world and having a specific skill are mutually exclusive. They're not. And in fact, I'd argue they go together. I mean, I want people in my organization who have an understanding not only of what they have to do, but what the impact of that is on the greater world and how the greater world can impact those particular decisions. I think they go together.
More and more school systems seem to...
They're not going to let you go until you get that thing.
Is it on? More and more school systems seem to be giving iPads, computers, starting in first grade, some in kindergarten, right through, and they have it right through. And talk about creativity. I'd like to know your feelings about giving computers to such young children. Is it good? Is it bad? Creativity, et cetera.
I'm probably not the expert on it, so I tell you there's probably people that can answer the question better than I can. I guess my perception would be that can be a very useful tool. If you think that's going to be a panacea for all the problems in education, then I think you're making a bad mistake. If you can get all the other pieces right and this becomes an enabler, then my sense is that's probably awfully good. I think the sooner you can get kids to understand how to use that, the better it is. Now, there's a flip side to that too, though, and that is, and I think we're only seeing it now, and again, I've been involved in education in a lot of different ways, although this is the first time that I've been in the education space. If you talk to people that have been in it a long time, they will tell you that this moment is the first time in higher education that we're going to understand what the generation that's coming up and the use of cell phones, et cetera, is. I've got kids that are 24 years old. They're a little bit too old because they had periods of time when they weren't on video games and they weren't on cell phones. But if you're in college today, your entire life was on texting, cell phones, video games, et cetera. We will find out now what the impact of that is. I don't think we know what that is, but I think we'll find it out. My sense is if it was an enabler and you were still focusing on kind of the greater person, how you communicate, how you work in groups, all those sorts of things, then it's terrific. If all of a sudden you think this is going to be the answer and this is all you're going to do, then I think you're going to be disappointed with the results.
Yeah, and I think just to put a simple framework around it, it's to Tom's point, it's how we use the technology, right? So I have seen incredible applications of technology with very young children, but it's in the right kind of dose for the right purpose, right? And here's where we're falling down on this. We have great technologies, we have adaptive software, we have great devices. Where it falls down is on how we're training teachers on how to use it. And so if you just say, if there's any great failing of technology, it's not going to be the technology itself, it's going to be how we as human beings actually are smart about how to use it, when to use it, why to use it, and in many ways when not to use it as well, because we've got many examples, by the way. I used to work in student affairs related world of higher ed, where I've had more vice presidents of student affairs tell me a story where they've walked out on campus, they talked to a student, and this was the best one I heard. He was on his computer out on the quad, and the vice president of student affairs said, "Well, how are you doing, Michael?" And he said, "Good." He's like, "I'm actually emailing with the girl I'm going on a date with tonight." And he goes, "Oh, that's great. Who is it? Maybe I know her." He's like, No, you wouldn't know her." He's like, "We just met online. I've never met her in person, and I'm really nervous to meet her in person." And the vice president goes, "Well, who is it? Try me. This is a huge campus." And so he says her name, and he goes, "No, I know her." And he goes, "She's sitting right over there." And the kid clammed up and was like, no, don't tell her I'm sitting here and you can't do that, And look, great that you might meet on LinkedIn. Not great if you can't actually meet up in person after meeting on LinkedIn. So I just think we have to be very smart about how and when and why we're using it, and not do as Tom said, just throw it out there as, oh, I want to solve student engagement. Give them a device. There we go. They're engaged. Look at that. Screen time. They're engaged. I mean, that's how we're measuring engagement. That has nothing to do with emotional engagement and learning.
I can't see a world where most jobs aren't going to have interaction with people.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. I'll just use this microphone. Thank you guys both so much. I think we could all spend the entire day talking about education.
Thank you. Good job, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Fun.
And I just want to say, one, I think Thomas Friedman would have been really happy. This felt like a conversation, and we all felt like we were part of it. And while there were a lot of scary statistics about the challenges, I think you also gave us an extraordinary amount of hope that we actually know what the answers are. And once you know the answers, then we just need to focus on acting on them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.